When I was 16, my friends and I had an apartment in the building his parents owned. It was an old building in Chicago and had hundreds of tunnels that Al Capone and company had built that his dad had blocked off. We used the roof as a place to go and smoke cigarettes. You had to go through the attic to get there though. There were no lights, so the only lights we had were from our crappy little brick/flip phones. One day, my friend Manny and I were going up to smoke. I told Manny I had to piss, so I did in the apartment. I went up and felt like there was someone there. It was pretty common for us to mess around with each other, so I said, "Manny, I know it's you. Stop mucking around." I followed this shadow figure thinking it was him. I yelled, "Stop playing, I know it's you," as I followed the figure. Then I heard from downstairs Manny say, "What?" I was terrified. I had just followed him to a corner. I ran back downstairs and asked if he was there. He was, talking to his girlfriend at the time, and I told him I didn't want to go upstairs. I know what I saw. People always try to say, maybe the shadow was your own. That's not possible, because I had a Motorola flip phone at the time, and I was only holding that in front of me. I saw a shadow person, and I know that others have as well. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep while taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and then they would hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door, a trip she made many times when she was alive. At first I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A couple of years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch as it opened into a double bed, the same couch that my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room. My father went right to sleep. I laid awake reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I heard more shuffling feet. Then I heard the fridge door being pulled open, and I heard the sound of glass bottles in the fridge door clinking against each other. Back then, they were still putting soft drinks in glass bottles. Feeling thirsty, I decided to get out of bed and go join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. I go into the kitchen, only to find myself alone. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen, open the fridge, and then I remembered my grandfather wasn't home. He was over at the neighbor's house, and he hadn't come back yet. Then I remembered my grandfather and father's ghost stories. Then I got scared. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leaped over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept for before I woke up with a start and a feeling of paralyzing fear in my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side, and it took a while for me to work up the courage to turn my head to my left. My head was covered by my blanket. There was a shadow being cast onto my blanket. The shadow was the outline of a head and shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style, up until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket off my face. When I did, in an instant, the paralyzing fear was gone. The shadow was gone, along with the sound of heavy breathing. My father was still asleep. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went back to sleep, only to wake up again on my right side. The paralyzing fear was back. Forcing myself to turn my head, the shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back. And again I had to summon up all my courage to move my hands and to take my blanket off my face, only to find nothing there, and the paralyzing fear gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times this happened throughout the night. Maybe a dozen, maybe more, but it happened a lot. The next morning I told my father what happened to me throughout the entire night while he slept. The sounds of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling feet, the fridge door opening, and nobody in the kitchen. Being awakened with a paralyzing fear, the shadow, the heavy breathing, the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me that I was seeing and hearing things, but instead he smiled and exclaimed, "That was Grandma." I grew up in a one-room schoolhouse. My great-aunt's husband's family had owned the whole hillside, a massive farm, and what became my house had been grain storage, and then the schoolhouse. It shows up on a map in 1844. I haven't been able to track it beyond that. Anyway, when it was a school, one night, a young pupil tried to break in, probably part of a bet or dare from his friends. The window he'd pried open came down on his neck and broke it instantly. Many moons later, on my 17th birthday, I had 5 or 6 girls over for a party, and we got out the Ouija board. We immediately got a barrage of messages. I remember we had to grab a notebook because we couldn't keep up with all the letters. The board told us a story about a 12-year-old boy, and then said that the boy had always watched out for me, because my smile reminded him of his sister Gertie's smile. The board asked me to go into the library. It's just a walk-in closet where I keep too many books, nothing fancy, and asked me to open the window. I walked into the library and immediately got so scared I had to run back out. I researched my house for a school project soon after because I wanted details. The boy had died at aged 12, and his sister's name was Gertrude. Every time I grab a book, I apologize for not opening the window, but also, I'm really kind of mad at the boy/ghost, because if he's real, he said he'd watch out for me. But my mum was a mean drunk, and her paedophile boyfriend lived with us for 7 years. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure how much I really believe in any of it, but I always can't help but apologize to the boy who's in the library. My grandmother always claims the pub her and my granddad used to own was haunted. They lived in the house that came attached. One night, her and the kids went to bed early, while my granddad tended the bar to closing time. She heard chatting noises from the kitchen, and assumed it was him. The next morning she asked him what he was doing in the kitchen the night before to make such noise. He said he never went near the kitchen that night, and that he went straight to bed after closing. Another night, my uncle, who was a young child at the time, told my grandparents that he saw someone atop of the stairs in the house. They weren't the only ones to be creeped out. No one has owned the house for very long after selling it. My mum went there to visit it for the first time in years recently. The bar owner said none of the staff will stay late, because they have claimed to see strange things or felt things that are weird. The owner herself won't live in the house because it creeps everybody out. When I was really little, small enough my feet didn't touch the floor when I sat on a chair, I used to stay with my grandparents on the weekends. My grandma did the routine of going to the toilet before I was put to sleep, and she walked off to finish preparing the hot water bottle. I was sitting there singing and looking at my feet swaying off the toilet. When I looked up, there was a pale older woman standing a couple of feet away smiling at me. I wasn't scared, just confused. She seemed lovely. I didn't remember how she disappeared, but I remember she was really pale. Like everything was a shade of rosy white. As typical grandparents do, all but essential lights were off, so the hallway leading off the toilet was quite dark. But I remember, it was like she was standing in her own soft light. My aunt had passed that year, and I'd only met her a few times in my short life. I'm not actually sure if we were related or not, but she just adored me. She was a very vivacious woman even at 80. She'd embraced the 60s and refused to act her age. I think maybe it was her, or the echo of her saying goodbye. Strange little memory. It could have been a dream, but it feels quite real. When I was younger, my family went on holiday to Turkey for a week. At the end of the week, we were asked to move rooms, due to our other room technically now being rented out by someone else. No problem with that at all. We moved to an unused room at the back of the hotel for the night, and we didn't unpack. We were leaving in the morning, so there'd be no point. After a few hours, I wake up needing the toilet, but I have this horrible feeling in my gut. The kind that feels like your stomach's been flipped and dropped a few times. My bladder is close to bursting though, so I push through it and stand to go to the bathroom. That's when I see him. A boy, small and dirty, wearing old-fashioned clothes which looked ragged and torn, is standing in the middle of the corridor just staring at me. I've never felt so frightened as I did then, when the world feels wrong. He didn't move or talk. He just stood and stared at me from underneath a flat cap. I'm pretty much shaking in fear and completely disregard my bladder to slowly sit back down and pull the blanket over myself. I peek. He's moved closer. I didn't fall asleep until a good while later, when my mum got up to go to the toilet. I asked her if she saw anything, and when she confusedly said no, I explained to her what had happened. I don't remember much apart from the boy in the night, but whenever it comes up, she always says that she never saw me so scared, and that she believes it happened because of my reaction. Not so spooky, but definitely frightening to a 12-year-old. Side note. The apartment we went to for the night overlooked a single house-walled complex, which had armed security guards and patrols every few hours. Black cars would pull up with old men in business suits. We waved to the guards and they waved back. It was friendly enough, but certainly dodgy. In 2002, I lived in the East San Francisco Bay Area with my husband and 2 toddlers. I was grieving over the sudden death of my mother a month before. She'd had a major heart attack and died at 52. On an average day, I left my babies at home with my husband to run a quick errand by myself. I drove a block over through downtown Hayward to hit up the grocery store. I was on my way home and stopped at a red light, waiting to make a left turn. The intersection had all blind corners, so it was difficult for me to see oncoming cars. The light turned green. I glanced both ways, waited for the appropriate second, and stepped on the gas pedal. It would not move. I tried again. Nothing. The car behind me honked. I looked down at my pedals quickly to see if something had possibly rolled under the pedal, and found nothing. I looked up, and suddenly a huge work truck loaded down with equipment and ran his red light at what must have been 50 miles an hour. I was stunned. I gasped, quickly pulled myself together, and stepped on the gas pedal, and it worked without no hesitation. Suddenly, I smelled my mother's favorite perfume. It was a really amazing experience. When I was young, I was on the bottom bunk and used to see legs walking parallel to my bed. This didn't happen often, only about twice a year. I would just scrunch my eyes shut and eventually roll over. After this happened for years, I was promoted to the top bunk and would now see the top of a grey head walking up and down. I told my parents what was happening, and as normal, they explained I was half asleep. When I was 14, I stopped seeing this man, but would hear really deep breaths right next to my ear. I was in a room on my own at the time, and would hold my breath, thinking it were me. Once my mum walked in while this was happening, and I flipped. I asked her to listen for the breathing, but it just stopped. After she left, it came back stronger. When I was 20 odd, I spoke to my mum about what used to happen, and she said on multiple occasions she would see shadows walk into my room, and then I would whimper or run to her bed. When she came over to my bed, she had actually seen the shadow twice, and that's why she came, making my skin crawl just writing this, and I'm 24 years old now. A little backstory. I go to school about 6 hours from my hometown. The drive to and from school is along a long and mostly empty stretch of interstate through the desert. There are at least 2 military bases along the drive, and a major nuclear plant is also located near the interstate. The area is known for weird sightings, especially at night. Aside from that, it's mostly cactuses, sand, and cattle. I was driving home from school in late June of this year, and was able to leave around 6 PM, meaning I'd be able to make most of the drive in the dark and get home at around midnight. It didn't bother me. I liked driving alone, and at night, and for the most part didn't really scare me. It gives me a sense of independence and adventure. About 3 hours into my drive, I get to the other side of the second military base. At this point it's pitch black, and for the most part I was on the road alone. I saw the occasional car going the opposite direction, but other than that and my high beams, there weren't any other lights besides the moon. Somewhere around this time, I noticed a light paralleling me, and my truck on the passenger side of my truck. I was doing around 95, and it kept up with me effortlessly. I wasn't along the railroad tracks, and there was no road over there, just desert and shrubs. It was not very close to me, and it was above the horizon, so I assumed it was something related to the military base and ignored it. Other lights appeared, and was driving along with the original light. There weren't flares, and I doubt there were military aircrafts, since I didn't think most of these would be equipped with one white light I'd be able to see. The lights were there for about an hour, just following the road, keeping a perfect pace with my truck. I lost them when I started going north on a small local highway. I've never seen anything like it before or since on the many times I've made that drive, and it makes the hairs on my arms stand up, just thinking about it. Before my brother was born, we moved in with my gran into her house, which was my mother's childhood home, and she had 3 spare rooms, and we were about to overgrow our current house. A good few years on from that, my brother and sister, who were about 5 and 8 respectively, were both asleep in the room they shared, and I went in, opened their window as it had been a really hot day, and being in the UK, we don't have aircon. A good few hours later, I came back into the room, as I figured it might have gotten cooler, and I didn't want my bro and sis being too cold. I gently woke up my sister, asking if she wanted me to shut the window, and that's when the bedroom light flicked on. I didn't think much of it, shut the window, and the light flicked on again. That's when I thought it was a bit odd, as I've seen lights flicker off and on while switched on, but never while they were switched off. The next day I mentioned it to my mother, and her face went chalk white. Her brother, my uncle, died in that room of an asthma attack, and she desperately tried to save his life that night. Unfortunately, to no avail. But the night of the flickering light was the same day as the anniversary of his death. It never freaked me out, but I found it quite comforting that he's watching over us. Although I've heard many stories from my uncle about his time as an EMT, this is the story that will stick with me until I die. About 6 years ago, my Uncle Vinny's paramedic crew responded to a call from a hotel in Philly, and it was one of the more horrific experiences he's had. The initial report stated that a maintenance man named Mike went to check on room 417, since water had been reported flooding into the hallway, and it was he who found the body. Mike informed 911 that there was a man in the in-suite hot tub who appeared to be deceased, and he was all but hyperventilating as he tried to make his report. Mike relayed that he saw the man and immediately backed out of the room, being careful to not drop his phone into the several inches of water on the floor. My uncle's 2-man paramedic team entered the room about 12 minutes later, and they almost gagged at the smell of feces and burning flesh. Vinny, who has a stomach of steel, had to press his hand to his mouth to keep himself from vomiting. The room was filled with steam, and the humidity was insanity, making the men sweat profusely. Their grip on their equipment was slipping, and they knew they needed to extract the victim quickly. The naked man was floating in the hot tub, a maniacal grin plastered on his face. From the looks of the man, he'd been in the water a while, since his bruised skin had started to peel off his body in long, squishy strips. Vinny held his breath and checked for vitals, while one of the other EMTs went to get a bag from the body. Even though my uncle saw corpses regularly, this method of death was a disturbing first for him, and something about the whole situation was unnerving. As Vinny placed his fingers on the man's wrist, expecting to feel nothing, he had to choke back a startled scream when the victim's hand shot out and grasped his arm. It wasn't a corpse. The John Doe didn't show any other signs of being responsive, but when the other EMT went to check the man's eyes for a dilation reaction, his pupil looked slitted, almost like those of a reptile. Vinny was weirded out, but dismissed it as a side effect of getting boiled alive like a hard-boiled egg. As the men removed the victim from the hot tub, the man began to thrash, strips of flesh splattering on the EMTs. They tried to pin the man down to keep him from hurting himself, but he was shockingly strong. As the last bits of flesh dropped to the floor, Vinny saw there wasn't more skin underneath. It was scales. His partner must have noticed it too, because both men began screaming in unison. The thing began to growl, and my uncle's normal desire to figure out problems turned into sheer fight or flight, with flight winning out. He ran from the hotel room, his teammate on his heels, and they slammed the door behind them. A moment later, they heard one of the windows shatter. The men had no idea how to explain to their boss what happened, but after some phone calls and a few men in black suits appearing, They were given a specific story to follow. They were told to say that John Doe tried to drown himself, and that the mentally unhinged man climbed down the fire escape when his attempt failed. Vinny, who was paid extra well to keep his mouth shut, never did tell anyone his story until he shared it with me recently. I could tell he didn't want to, but I was the only one in the family who would believe him. The only reason I even shared his ridiculous story is because he thinks someone has been stalking him the last few weeks, and he's worried that that thing has returned. I thought it was crazy, until I went to his house yesterday and saw a trail of bipedal clawed footprints underneath his windowsill. Now my uncle is missing, and I think I'm the only one who really knows what happened to him. I hail from a small, rural town in Ontario, about an hour from Ottawa. Nothing bad happens there. People don't even lock their car doors at night. I never really thought anything like this could ever happen to me, but then I guess it did. My friend Angie and I were out in Ottawa around early July, sort of near Canada Day if I recall correctly. We had been bar hopping and having fun exposing ourselves to city life, us being country bumpkins and all. Angie is drunk, and I am not, because I have to drive us home, as there's no Uber or taxi to bring us to our little town, and if they do, it's at least a $60 cab ride. Me being sober might have been what saved our lives. We decided we wanted to go and visit a club. We'd never been clubbing before, so we intended to Google a place and head to that location. Instead, we got lost. We're somewhere facing a bunch of duplex housing and a single hotel. It's not especially deserted, but out of the way from the neon lights, if you know what I mean. It's silent on this street. Empty. We decide to turn back and choose another club that's easier to find when we come across these tourists. One's male and one's female. They're holding a phone and a printed out page with some Airbnb directions, and they approach us, asking if we have our phones with us. Angie immediately obliges with them, whips out her phone, and the man explains that they're here on vacation but can't find their Airbnb, and they need to use our phone to call the renters so that he can figure out which house it is. This man's accent is German, possibly Scandinavian. Definitely not French or Spanish. My friend is willing, but fortunately for her, she's used up all her minutes and can't call anyone. But she can call me, or we could plug the address into Google Maps and show them that way. Angie turns to me and I panic. This whole time I've been looking at the couple, and it's all too weird. How could you be vacationing in a foreign country in today's digital age and not have a phone plan? How could you not know where the address is if you've got a printed copy of the Airbnb in your hands and street signs everywhere? Why are they alone in this empty street past midnight, with an airport just 30 minutes away? If they called a cab to their destination, the cab driver would have dropped them off on their doorstep. So many questions are rising in my head, and I immediately are getting signs of red flags and anxious nauseousness. I make up this lie that I only have my iPod and that I don't have data on it. Angie calls me out on it, but I shut her up and drag her away from the tourists and closer to the hub of downtown. Angie is asking why we didn't help them, and I run my thoughts by her. She looked at me and goes, "It's strange. I noticed they didn't have any luggage, but I didn't give it a second thought." Needless to say, it concluded our night. 3 a.m. Unknown problem. Priority 2 dispatch, which means closest apparatus responds lights and sirens while everyone else responds normally. Functioning as the attendant in charge that night on a basic life support ambulance. We were furthest out, but something didn't feel right, so I upgraded my unit's response to priority 1, lights and sirens, and moot point at 3 AM, but covering my driver's arse. We were first on the scene, because the engine was inexplicably delayed as they were just a block down the street. We encountered a cop running up to my unit and saying, "Follow me." So we did. This was a group of townhouses in a shoe horse around a commons area that was probably 75 yards wide and 25 yards deep. I get out and follow this cop. At that point, an officer comes charging out the door of a unit with a bundle in his hands. He explains it's an infant and he's not breathing. Direct him to the back of the ambulance and unwrap the bundle. I find a 3-month-old infant, clearly very dead but still warm. I have to work it because of protocol. I call for my third to bag him while I start compressions. My third freezes, but at that moment the whole engine crew shows up and we get to work. We work him to the hospital, but know it's futile as the paramedic couldn't pass the tube due to rigor. We get to the hospital and he's declared dead by the pediatric doctor. We later found out the baby was in a motel 10 miles away abandoned. A couple took him home and were taking care of him, until they could call CPS the next day. I never did understand this side of the story. They woke up to feed him at approximately 3 AM, and found him non-responsive, which is when they called 911. I kept tabs on the case for a while, and found out the child died from an OD of heroin, most likely passed through the milk of the mother. To my knowledge, the mother has never been found. That call sits heavily with me to this day, and it was 7 years ago. I still have flashbacks when performing infant CPR. Everything gets dark, and I'm back in the box, reliving that night. This isn't my story, but one a friend told me not long ago that I found fascinating, mostly because of the genuine emotion in his telling of it, the fear in his voice, and on his face was visceral and contagious as he told the story, even though it happened years ago when he was a kid. About 15 years back, a friend of mine and his group of friends were out having their fun of our little Rust Belt town not too far from a big city, doing all the things kids do before they discover drugs and girls and all the other things that take you out of your childhood sense of adventure. In particular, they went out into this part of town we call the Flats, originally zoned industrial, but after the big fiber plant closed, nature reclaimed the place for the most part. So it was fields and woods once, but you got past the big dilapidated factories that sit by the tracks. For obvious reasons, the parents around there tell their kids to keep well away from that area, because it could be seriously dangerous. But the thing that strikes me as odd about this part of town is that there have constantly been rumours that there was some kind of waste material that's just buried out there that's toxic, allegedly radioactive, and or related to the Manhattan Project. It's become local folk wisdom that there's something out there you don't want to get into, since my dad was a kid in the 50s. My friend and his posse were playing Manhunt, which I'm told is basically hide and seek, and so he was going through the woods looking for his friends who were hiding pretty successfully from him. He reaches a break in the trees, steps out onto a small meadow, and that's when he sees it. Across the field, about 20 yards away, there was something squatting in the tree line, clad in all silver and a bulbous helmet, looking almost like some astronaut from a D-grade sci-fi flick. It saw him in the same instant he saw it. It leapt in surprise, but there was something off and almost simian about the stance it took up when it leapt, almost like a chimp in a spacesuit, but taller and close to a human. Just as quickly, it raised its arm, pointed, and somehow fired a tiny metal dart at my friend, which hit him in the hand as he turned to run. He ripped the thing out of his hand while running and screaming for his friends. As he told me this with a shaky voice, he showed me the small scar on his hand. I'm a skeptical person, and it's a cheesy story. But this is a guy who's not capable of faking the trembling voice and faraway look of someone who's remembering something that terrified them. I insisted we go look around that place after hearing this, but we found nothing strange, except for a weird-looking warehouse-type building closer to the freeway than the woods that was relatively new, an empty wilderness. To this day I have no clue what he saw, but I believe he did see something. I have a few stories to share. The first. I once answered a call. Two brothers were arguing over drinks, and one of their girlfriends or wives was over. Anyway, the brothers are drinking heavily, and one pulls out a gun and shoots the other. When I received the call, I can barely get the guy's address over him screaming to send the paramedics. He keeps shouting, "Where the hell are they?" while I'm trying to stay calm and give CPR instructions and tell him to tell the female there to stop the bleeding, as in apply pressure on the wound. Furthermore, medical cannot go on scene until police have secured the firearm. Listening to the pain in someone's voice while they're screaming for help kind of haunts you. Both of them had to be around 30 years old, and I couldn't imagine killing a family member. So the next one happened later at night, probably around 11:30 p.m. A female calls me screaming. She was yelling, "I'm burning!" So I told her to stop, drop and roll, and once the flames were out, to turn on the hose and put cool water on until the paramedics got there. Once she was a little calmer, I was able to learn more about what happened. She'd been drinking with her boyfriend and he got depressed and decided tonight was the night he was going to commit suicide and kill his girlfriend. So in his intoxicated state, he found a gas can and started dumping it on himself and his girlfriend, lit them both on fire, and it also managed to catch the house, fence and yard on fire too. Both of them survived. He got the worst of the burns. The house and fence had minimal damage. The final story. This one was probably one of the hardest calls I've ever taken. The phone rings and there's a little girl of 8 to 10. She's screaming and crying, "Daddy's dead." I can't calm her down at all. She keeps crying on the line, and in the background I can also hear two other small girls crying. I was watching our call logs, and more calls are coming in. The same ones. They're all about the gunshots fired. What had happened is that 3 guys had decided to break into a house and thought it was empty, so they rang the doorbell to make sure. The dad startled them and they shot him. So the mother runs out to see what happened, and she got shot as well. The guys took off, leaving the 3 girls aged 18 to 12 to call 911. We're not allowed to disconnect a phone call until police or EMS arrive on scene, so my heart was breaking for a small family that had lost both parents in one sad accident. I listened to the girl for 6 minutes and 37 seconds before police arrived on scene. The good news is, the mother lived. Why not even make it 4 stories? So the last one is a bit hard to keep straight. Okay. So an older lady calls us, and she says she hit a trash bag on a dark stretch of highway and she thinks there's blood on her car. So we send a police officer out there. They pop her hood and it looks like a slaughterhouse. Brain matter, human hair, gross. At first everyone thought it was a deer, but looking closer at the hair and a piece of scalp, it was determined human. So we start calling other agencies to see if anyone had some vicious car accident. Finally, we get the rest of the story. A female was coming home from work late at night at 3 a.m. or so, and wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and was eating a yogurt with a spoon. It was a very dark stretch of freeway, and for some reason she swerved and overcorrected and flew out of her windshield and landed in the road. She was still alive at this point. A guy pulled over and called 911. He didn't speak English, so the info was coming in really slow. Then our elderly lady speeds by and doesn't see the man or poor lady lying on the road. You can put the rest together. I can't imagine what this old lady thought when the police told her she might have killed someone without knowing it. Yeah, we deal with some messed up stuff. This happened to me back in 2007. I was 9 years old, and my brother was 14. My mum had sent us out of the house with about $30 to go see a movie and maybe get a bite to eat afterwards. After watching the movie, it was getting pretty dark, and I was ready to go home. My brother wanted to get something to eat first, and we agreed to walk to McDonald's, which was only a couple of blocks away from the movie theatre. On our way there, we were stopped and approached by a man. He had a friendly smile plastered on his face, and he was holding his child's hand. There didn't seem to be anything off about this man. He was just an average-looking guy, and seemed to be nothing more than a father having a day out with his son. "Do you two think you could give my son and I a hand real quick? We need help loading a mattress onto the back of our truck. The truck is just up the road." "Sorry, but we really don't have time," my brother said. It was at this time I noticed the little boy. He was about 8 years old and looked abnormally thin. He had a blank expression on his face and wore clothes that were much too big for him. I turned my attention to the man, who was now mumbling to my brother about how it would only take a few seconds. My brother kindly declined the offer. Being the helpful kid that I was, I joined in with the man and tried to persuade my brother that we should help them out. I turned to my brother, who was now staring down at the little boy. My brother had a disturbed expression on his face as he looked down at the child, and the child stared back at my brother blankly. I don't understand why my brother had that face. He grabbed my hand and said, "I think that my mum's over there." He pulled me, and we began walking away from the man. I didn't understand what was going on, and why my brother had lied to the man about our mother being over there. He didn't let go of my hand, and practically dragged me until we were a far enough distance away from the man and his son. I looked back at the man, and I could still see him holding his son's hand. Only now he wasn't smiling anymore. He had a look of fury on his face as he yanked the little boy by the arm and they walked away. I pulled away from my brother's grasp and bombarded him with questions. He shushed me, pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number, and began pacing around nervously while talking on the phone. I remember the police showing up, and my mum came soon after. She took me home, but my brother was left with the police. I asked my mother what was going on, and she said the police were questioning my brother because the man we had encountered was dangerous. That's all she told me, and I went to bed. By next morning I had almost completely forgotten about the incident, and things went back to normal. It wasn't until a few days ago that the memories flooded back into my mind, and I decided to call my now 22-year-old brother to get some answers. When I brought up the ordeal again with him, he finally gave me the information I wanted to know, and now that I know everything, I understand how terrifying our encounter with the man truly was. My brother told me that the man was constantly trying to convince us to come with him. He happened to look at the little boy. The little boy then looked at my brother, with his eyes filled with terror, and mouthed the words, "I'm not his son. Please help me." Then his expression went back to being completely blank, almost as if he'd never said anything at all. This is why he had become so freaked out and snatched me away. When he called the police, they hurried down and he described the man as best they could. They couldn't do much with the little information my brother had given, because we hadn't even seen the car where the man supposedly hid. My brother told me that a few weeks into the investigation, they had found the little boy who was with the man, dead. His body had been cruelly dumped in the woods. The cause of death? Malnutrition and dehydration. If my brother and I had gone with the sicko, we likely would have met the same fate. He obviously couldn't have kidnapped both of us on his own, as my brother was fairly strong. That meant he must have had partners who could have helped him snatch up unsuspecting kids. Unfortunately, they were never able to catch any of the sickos who did this to the child, but the man was definitely not his father. His real parents had been searching for their son for almost a month. They'd managed to kidnap him, and use him as their puppet, and try to kidnap other children. Every time I think about that boy, I feel a deep pity for him. He was only a year younger than I was at the time, and I can only imagine how terrible it must be to slowly starve to death. And to the disgusting bastards who starves and murders children, you better hope we never meet. I have a few stories. It's fairly common in my city for newborn babies to be wrapped in a plastic bag and placed in a gym bag/backpack. Desperate mothers who are often victims of sexual assault feel they have nowhere to turn to and can't afford a child. The first time I had to examine a DOA newborn in such a condition was an eye-opener. They often won't cut the cord and placenta, and it will still be attached. Bear in mind, this is in the African heat, and it can be a while before anyone notices the bag in the first place. I've been kicked in the head by a young lady out of her mind on Niobe, who believed she was a demon sent to kill 100 people. We fished her out of a municipal swimming pool at around 1 in the middle of winter. It took 3 cops and 2 firefighters to hold her down, while my ALS sedated her. It also took far more than we would have, though, to knock her out. When she looked me in the eyes and told me that I'm doomed, and she was going to kill me, it was a very strange moment. I attended a structural fire in an old office building that was used as informal housing. Very high density. At first we thought we only had 1 body, but we realized while doing the declaration that what we thought was the body's humerus was actually all that was left of a baby. The fire had been so intense that the skull had fused with the concrete floor and had been crushed by debris. Looked almost like a sooty, black, slightly 3D image of a small screaming monkey. That's an image and smell that took months to get out of my head. It still pops back into my head if someone's cooking pork. From when I was young, I had nightmares. Nightmares about giants. These giants could see through the windows, they were so tall and thin. If there was a gap around the shades, they could still see in. If I hid under my mother's bed, the dust ruffle didn't go all the way to the floor, so they would still see me. In these nightmares, I would hide in the closet, try to open the door as well as I could, and hide under a pile of clothes. One morning, I woke up in that closet. Throughout my youth, I'd have nightmares of a similar sort. I could not sleep near a window, especially if it was an open window, even in summer. One time, it was tall, skinny monkeys on the roof trying to get in, or it would be triangular objects in the sky flying at very high speeds. All the time, I knew nothing of aliens, and I joined a group that dealt with all manner of oddness, including UFOs. I mentioned these nightmares, and they were convinced that I was an abductee. It began making sense, as these nightmares would often occur about the time I was ovulating, including one nightmare when I woke up on a table in a room, with something like a huge metal bowl inverted in me. I swore I could hear my mother's voice telling me I was okay, and that they weren't going to hurt me. They needed to just do these tests. Then I saw them. I watched them stick a very long and thin needle-like tool into my abdomen on the left, as they extracted an ova, which they showed me. I saw it as if it were magnified, roundish cream-coloured, with an area that was a little more brownish. They explained to me this one was damaged, and they'd need another. I remember thinking, cool. Then realizing what I said and what was going on, I pretty much passed out and not woke up again until the morning. As I said, this was a regular occurrence, until one year during ovulation, I happened to be on a military base. Apparently they weren't going to arouse the ire of the US military. After that, the abductions ceased. I was getting older anyway, and my viability was probably not up to snuff. Fast forward many years, I was house sitting way out in a rural area. There are neighbours, but they're a bit spread out. But they're 15 miles from the nearest town in a heavily wooded area. I'd gone to bed around 1:32 and had turned off all the lights and gotten to bed facing the window and closed my eyes. Soon, I could tell there was light shining in through the window. Odd but not completely unheard of that someone would be driving down that road a little late. I then realized I didn't hear gravel, and the light didn't seem to move. Was someone sitting outside my house with their headlights on? I got out of bed and peeked through some blinds, and saw what made me do a backflip and go over to the bed to get my glasses. I slammed them on my face, bounced back to the window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Across the street is nothing but a line of trees. Behind those trees were huge white lights, the size of the full moon, drifting very slowly downwards at an angle. When the white lights were behind the trees, I could see red lights around them. Back behind those trees is nothing but a very large swamp. There was no noise, and I stood there staring blankly until I could no longer see the lights. Needless to say, there was no sleep to be had on my part, and I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see little green men out in the front yard. It was a little easier to handle when I could put my experiences down to just nightmares, but I was too well aware and fully awake for this one. My mother kept children in our home. There was a toddler she kept named Josh. One afternoon, while his mother picked him up, she asked my mother if she could talk to her. She said that Josh had been waking up screaming at night, and they didn't know what to do. She said they would go into his room, and he would be screaming about the boy, who was making mean faces at him and scared him. He would point to the corner of the ceiling of his room. My mum told him it was probably just night terrors, and said that he would grow out of them. A few days later, when they brought Josh over, his hand was bandaged. The mother told my mother that Josh had been playing in the toy box when the top slammed on his hand. She said it was very odd, because the toy box lid had been laying all the way back on chain hinges, and she didn't understand how it came all the way forward from that position and slammed on his hands. That Monday, she told my mum and I something that gave us chills. She said that on Friday evening she was sitting on the chair sorting through pictures, and Josh was looking at them with her. He suddenly became hysterical and began crying and screaming, "The boy! The boy!" She said he was pointing to a specific picture. The picture was of the boy's big sister. She was born with health problems and died before he was born, when she was 7. The mother was looking at pictures because it was the 5-year anniversary of the little girl's passing. One of her health problems was encephalitis, and because she had to have shunts, her hair was kept short, making her look a bit like a boy. She said it all made sense. In the corner of the ceiling where he pointed and yelled, "The boy," each night he woke up screaming, and there on the shelf was a stuffed toy that had belonged to his sister. The toy box he played in that had slammed on his hand also belonged to his sister. She said they had not told him about his sister yet, because they felt that he was too young to understand her death. They said that they immediately moved the stuffed toy out of his bedroom. They put it in the toy box, and they put the toy box in the attic. The past 2 nights since, he has slept peacefully. I am a firefighter. This is the story of how I responded to a call involving the Antichrist. I was just getting off work when a call goes out across dispatch, saying there was a possible overdose and that we needed to respond. When we get to the scene, I note nothing out of the ordinary, until we enter the home. After asking where the patient is, we're escorted to a back room, where a man exiting is rebuttoning his pants. We enter the room to a sheriff's deputy detaining a petite naked woman who had attempted to jump out of a window and had shat herself. She had flung both blood and shit everywhere. She tells her mother, the owner of the home that's been very helpful, that she has a parasite inside her and that she doesn't blame her mother for letting her father sexually assault both of them. The paramedics then enter the scene and attempt to administer sedatives via IV to calm this woman down, who claimed the only drug she's on is Prozac and a little weed. The most memorable moment came next. In the moment that the deputy released her hand to the paramedics to administer the IV, the patient then slides her entire hand into her rectum. She then begins to spasm violently and tells us if we don't stop being racist, she'll smite us because she is the Antichrist. It all ended when I was given a second pair of handcuffs to bind her ankles. I was in the metaphorical blast zone of the Antichrist's arse, and therefore terrified for my life. All went well, thankfully, and I was spared the brown death. I was then called back to the paramedics to handle her, and to this day, I've never dealt with anyone quite like the Antichrist. My father's girlfriend told of this experience. When she lived alone in an apartment, she once fell asleep in the living room with the lights still on. She suddenly woke up super late into the night and saw this human-like creature staring at her. It was super short like a child, but had a large head and huge ears flapping between them, up and down to float in the air. It had this grotesque grin, and she was basically frozen in fear. After a few moments, the creature just disappeared into thin air. She also had other stories of waking up in the night to something invisible choking her violently. I grew up in a small town in Texas. By small, I mean it takes less than 5 minutes to drive through. It is most certainly a place where everyone knows everyone else, because they all grew up together. I was very close with my grandfather. He would come by my parents' house and pick me up, and take me on trips to various different properties he had cows and such at. I would get to help feed them. There was one particular field he rented that was behind this old and abandoned rock house. While he was finishing up, I would swing on the outside of this gate facing towards the house. There was a screened-in porch within my vision, and apparently I saw a man through it staring at us. I can still remember that I instantly did not like him, and I had no idea why, but I wanted him to leave. I said, "Paw, who's that man?" and pointed towards the porch, but of course he was gone. He, oddly enough, was not skeptical at all, and just asked me to describe him. As I got older, my parents and I were sitting around talking, and the subject came up. My dad said that my grandpa told him I saw Harold, something or other, who my grandpa knew and had also lived in that house. He had killed himself on that porch a couple of years before that. My grandfather raised me because my father was ill all the time and my mother took care of him. Fast forward to high school, and I have next to no relationship with my mother. It is after school, and my sister and I are sitting with friends while my mum keeps calling me, and I keep ignoring her. After an hour, I answer, and I find out my grandmother came home and couldn't find my grandfather, and my mother couldn't go check on them. I don't recall why. My sister and I left immediately and were speeding down towards their house while we made a game plan. My grandmother is almost deaf and not very mobile after a day of shopping, so I decide to head to the garage where my grandfather may have been working, and she wouldn't have been able to see or hear him, and go to check. My sister decided to go out back and check the garden with my grandmother, as she could not climb very high. Finally, we reached the house and split. I go out into the garage and saw a bunch of boxes lying on the floor, and saw feet coming out from under them, and I froze. But I didn't make the connection that he was under the boxes. I could see his legs, and they were a sickly colour. My sister was heading towards me, telling me about how she didn't see him. She asks if I found him, and I had forgotten the words, and she just screamed out, "Oh God." She ran to grab the phone and dialed 911. That snapped me back into reality, and I moved into EMT mode, as I had been training underage. Anyway, I removed the boxes and couldn't get a pulse. His body was freezing, but I'd started CPR. He had to live through this. My sister was explaining to the dispatcher what was happening, and I kept up with CPR. Turns out, he had a massive coronary and had taken the boxes with him as he fell to the floor. He had been there an hour. This same amount of time I had been ignoring my mother. I tried so hard, and I couldn't do anything. Once I heard the sirens, I bolted. The problem was my sister was so hysterical on the phone. They had no idea what had happened, and with me running, it looked like I had done something. The firefighters caught me and held me as I was thrashing to get away. They took statements and left a few hours later. I got my EMT license, but I wish I hadn't. I was just an idiot kid who could have saved the life of the man who raised me. Don't ignore your family. Answer your phones, people. In high school, I was over at my then boyfriend's house. He was the oldest of 5 kids. We were told by his little sister, who was probably around 9 or 10 at the time, that there was a family that used to live in that house, and that they were all murdered. That she could talk to them sometimes. We thought she was just making stuff up, and humoured her, and always changed the subject. One day at school, we saw our classmate drive his beat-up old Toyota over the grassy divide to avoid sitting in parking lot traffic. My boyfriend and I joked the entire way home that Yota found his own way out. We walked into his house, and his little sister was sitting in the kitchen. She was quiet for about 10 minutes or so and says, Mark, the boy ghost, went to school with you today." We rolled our eyes and muttered something along the lines of, "Someone forget their crazy pills?" She replied, "He said something about Yoda's way out. What does that mean?" And my boyfriend and I sat there with our mouths dropped open. No one else was in the car with us, and we went straight from the car to his house. A few weeks later, we were spending a weekend outside washing my car, and the kids were out with us. A huge flash of light happened, and this was a bright sunny day, and it wasn't a mirrored car drive by or anything. And his little sister looks up at the sky and says, "The ghosts went home," and we never heard another word about any of it again. Still creeps me out. I used to live in a very small town that was predominantly safe for kids. It only had some drug issues. Anyway, My house was located in a small and upscale part of the town, which mainly housed families. There was a small pond with lots of green in the neighborhood that was about a 5-minute walk from my house. To get to the pond, you had to go down a grass hill. Neighborhood kids, including myself, would always go down to the pond for hours to catch frogs, skip rocks, etc. So now to this story. On this particular day, it was raining and pretty cold, so there were no other kids at the pond. My best friend and her brother, who was 1 year older than us, and myself, decided to head down to the pond for a bit. After about half an hour, we see that at the top of the hill, a minivan pulls up. We thought nothing of it, as there was a neighborhood mailbox at the top of this hill, and we thought lots of people stopped to get their mail. A man started to get out of the minivan, and I remember him being older, probably in his 60s. Another note, since we live in such a small town, everyone knows everyone, or could at least recognize everyone. I remember thinking it was strange that I had never seen this man before in town or in the neighborhood. He got out and just stared at the three of us for what seemed to be forever. All of a sudden he yelled at us, "It's not safe down there. You kids better come up here." My best friend and her brother looked terrified, and I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. We didn't say anything back, and he continued to repeat that phrase. "It's not safe down there. You kids better come up here." Our fight or flight reaction kicked in, and we all booked it to the other side of the hill, which was only about a few meters away from him and the minivan. As soon as he saw us running, he got into his minivan and started driving slowly behind us, literally following us until we reached my house. Luckily, my garage door was open, and my parents' 2 cars were parked inside. We hid behind one of my parents' cars and watched as he pulled to the side of the house and parked. My parents were inside, but obviously had no idea what was happening. He stayed parked in front of my house for a few minutes, until my dad came outside to take the trash out and saw the 3 of us were hiding. I guess the man saw my dad and drove away, but as soon as he left, we told my parents everything. Even until this day, 12 years later, my parents still think we were being overdramatic, and that it was a man that was genuinely concerned for our safety because of the weather. But nonetheless, we weren't allowed to go back to the pond anymore. I don't blame them for thinking this though, as the 3 of us tended to be a bit dramatic and get worked up easily. But I knew, from the way I had a strange feeling when I first saw him at the top of the hill, that something was off, and to this day, I believe that man was planning something. I had a call around 9 just after I came on duty, of an elderly male with a possible high fever. Not a whole lot of info, as the caller was his elderly wife, who according to the dispatcher was hard to understand. Anyway, we head out and get there 7 minutes or so later. As we go in, the wife is sitting at the kitchen table, just inside the door, so we ask her what's going on. She answers that he's been complaining he's too hot all morning. We go into the next room, which is dark due to the curtains covering the windows, but there's enough light to see a dead man sitting in the chair. Mind you, he was not recently dead. I'm talking about blackened face, rots, and rat bites around the mouth. Wasn't complaining this morning type of dead. I set down my equipment, and my partner goes to turn on the light next to his chair, so we can verify the obvious. As she goes to reach for the light, the dead man groans and reaches for her hand. After collectively shitting our pants, we jump into action, and come to find out he was on oxygen and a smoker. He was complaining about being hot because he was literally burning up. What looked like signs of death on his face were scorch marks of melted plastic. And to answer the obvious question, I don't know. He was still alive when we got him to the hospital, and I never asked what happened to him. This happened when I was a kid, about 12 years ago. My family and I lived in the back bayous of South Louisiana, and we didn't have a lot of neighbours. So there were long stretches of woods and water with no people around. One day, my best friend and I were playing between our houses. They were about 1.5 miles apart, and we were walking on the main road, which was really a single-lane gravel road, when a large red truck with huge tyres and a double-extended cab comes rolling down the road. We knew he wasn't local, because there were only a handful of people living back there, and we knew them and their vehicles by sight. The truck slowed as it reached us, and we were smart enough to back up away from the road, out of arm's reach. The man in the truck was your typical redneck, mullet, scraggly beard, wife-beater and jeans, but he seemed friendly enough as he explained that he was lost and looking for the way back towards town, since getting lost in the depths of the Louisiana bayou happens more often than you'd imagine. We didn't think much of it. Politely, but from a distance, we gave him directions back towards town. He thanked us, drove off around a curb, and we continued walking. Suddenly we hear the sound of a truck spinning out on the gravel road and revving its engines. We looked at each other and then heard the crunch of tyres coming at us quickly. We broke into an all-out run at top speed. We rounded another curve, and there we saw the wooden bridge that followed over the bayou channel. Without hesitation, we dove over this side and crawled up under the bridge, where it nearly met with the road, huddling as tightly as we could, ignoring the spiders and ants that we were disturbing. The truck came, roared up and got over the bridge, and then turned around and came back. The man stopped on the bridge and got out, coming to stand by the railings. He then walked the length of the bridge on both sides, frequently looking over the edges, and stopped to peer between the slats of the bridge. Fortunately, we were deep into the shadows, so he wouldn't have been able to see us without physically climbing down. He spit, swore, got into his truck and drove off. We waited for a long time before we crawled out from under that bridge. To this day, I'm convinced he had very bad intentions. I've had a few creepy experiences. Number 1. We did have one call when we picked up a patient who claimed they were being tracked by the US government. Of course, nursing staff and everyone involved assume that it's just some kind of delusion, run-of-the-mill psych patient case. He spent time talking about documents that he previously had access to, and how the government didn't want him to release the information to anyone. He yelled and screamed as we put him on the cot about being sane, and that we were being brainwashed. As we loaded our patient into the rig, he says we'll be followed to the next facility. Jokingly, my partner asks him what's gonna follow us, and he replied with a black Lincoln Town car. As we leave, almost immediately, there was a black town car behind us, which stayed behind us for roughly 15 minutes transport, and only disappeared as we got a few blocks from the new facility. We dropped off the patient, and all he had was a smug "I told you so" look on his face. 2. Another call we had, which I would consider the creepiest patient experience I've ever had, involved a pediatric patient who refused to lay on the stretcher on their back, and instead wanted the back of the cot up and to lay face down, stared me in the face while I was sitting in the jump seat the entire time with a very ominous smile, back at probably a 70-degree angle. Transport time was almost an hour and a half. When I was a kid, my room used to be across from our bathroom. One night, I saw something peek out the door and wave at me. I vividly remember this. I never took my eyes off the door while I screamed. My dad took me into the bathroom after he looked himself and showed me nothing was there. I never took my eyes off the door for a second. I remember that part very vividly. I've had nightmares about the thing that waved at me for almost 20 years now. I moved so many times from being in the army and pursuing other job opportunities, but I occasionally see it out of the corner of my eye. I've even seen it now where I live. I can perfectly describe it to you. Loose white skin, dark pants, no shoes, and looks like a mummy without wrappings. Empty eye sockets and weird crazy spiked hair, kind of like a troll doll. For a reference, picture the cover of Iron Maiden's Iron Maiden album and replace the eyes with empty sockets. This is what has been scaring me since before I was in kindergarten. I could be crazy. It could have been a really bad nightmare that I had as a kid that traumatized me. But even so, I should not be seeing it when I'm fully conscious, right? I've actually searched a lot of shows I used to watch before the incident, and the only thing I could come up with as being the source of my nightmare is Billy from Hocus Pocus, which is my all-time favorite Halloween movie. I so want it to easily be explained as a Hocus Pocus dream gone wrong, but I seriously can't get over the fact that I'm still seeing it on occasion. If anyone has any theories or questions, I'm always willing to discuss with anyone who can take it seriously. The first time I ever had someone dancing naked and bloody on the top of a police car during a psychotic breakdown was an eye-opening experience for a rookie. That guy got his blood all over me and ruined my new jacket. He kept staring at me maniacally, constantly repeating random numbers and saying, "I am Satan," over and over again. It's kind of weird how quick that sort of stuff becomes routine. I had another psych patient early in my career that sticks with me for the gross factor. She was an Asian lady in her 60s, but swore that she was a 15-year-old girl. She would keep saying the most morbid and grotesque things over and over. I don't remember the exact details, but she did talk about being sexually abused repeatedly and having her skull caved in the morning. She then started going on about how she's been bleeding every single day for the last 3 years, and I asked her if she was currently bleeding, because a hemorrhage in the vagina is a legitimate medical complaint, and who knows, she very well could have been sexually assaulted. At that point, she removed a bloody maxi pad and threw it at me, smacking it square in my chest. My partner erupted in laughter and said, "Dude, that is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen." On Halloween about 4 years ago, I was working a shift with a good buddy of mine, and we got a run for an unknown medical. We were a couple of cocky mid-20-something. On the way up the elevator, we got caught up in an argument over A's versus Giants Bay Area baseball. We almost blew off the security guard when he was opening the door at some random apartment. "Oh, she's definitely dead," the guard said. And we were instantly like, "What?" Usually the cops get to this sort of thing before us. Plus, we had no idea a dead body was involved. Yet there she was, reclined in her lazy boy with her feet up all the way in a position of comfort. Her eyes were rolled back and mouth agape, just like in the movies. Over her head was a translucent plastic bag neatly taped around her neck. I don't know if it was the combination of reclined death in a lazy boy or a nonchalant plastic bag, a possible murder, or the fact that it was Halloween. But that was a creepy scene. I think we actually had a shooting and a stabbing on that shift as well. In general, the creepiest calls for me are the hangings. Something about a body just hanging lifelessly in the dark. The last one I had, we were dispatched to without lights and sirens, which in itself is weird. We ended up at a Safeway with a bunch of cops who had no idea where the hanging was. Apparently, a guy was shopping casually in the produce section. This guy mentions to us that the body was at the construction site across the street. Needless to say, we told the guy to show us where now. Sure enough, there was a well-executed hanging about 5 feet off the ground. Good rope rigged and tied over 2 cement blocks on the other side of a chain-link fence. Seeing a dead body hanging in the dead of night is one of those things that stays with you. You keep it in your back pocket, so you can tell the stories later when someone asks you about the job. Probably about 8 months ago, I had been living in this apartment that weird things were happening in. Doors opening in front of me, strange noises and whatever, and it was my first time living alone. But I had just left an abusive relationship, so I was just happy to be on my own. One night after a long shift at the hospital, I was laying down in bed with my dog curled up at the end. He's a big lab mix that is always goofy and friendly. Not so much a guard dog as I'd hoped, so I can keep a pistol on my nightstand and the hallway light on, which gives a faint glow into my room. I passed out pretty quickly from exhaustion, and knowing I had to be back up for work at 6 a.m. The next thing I know, I'm being woken up by a low, creepy growl coming from my dog. He never growls. For a few seconds I'm frozen. I feel like my heart is pounding out of my chest. My eyes popped open, and I see a figure of a man standing over my bed. The worst part is he appears to be holding a woman hostage with one arm around her neck. I freak out, grab the gun, and aim it at the man, my arms shaking. I don't remember if I said anything to him, but as I pulled the gun, he drags the woman through the wall. At this point I can't breathe. I'm fully alert and awake. I bolted out of my house with my pup and drove to a friend's house for the night. I now have a roommate and never told her about the weird stuff, and a couple of days after moving in, she asked if I had ghosts or something, because something kept switching her fan to off in the middle of the night, and random stuff like that. I've seen a lot of stuff. There was a lady with open sores, full of maggots. A guy on PCP jump out of this story apartment building holding a 2-year-old kid. A woman poured gasoline on herself and burned to death. A guy getting decapitated in a Jeep wreck, going the wrong way on the interstate. A crapload of shooting deaths. A 9-person shooting. A guy throwing a 1-year-old. Might be the creepiest though. We didn't know what happened when we showed up. We started doing CPR, and the 1-year-old had an identical twin in the room watching us. That was pretty messed up. I saw a guy jump out of a 9-story window. He didn't bounce. Burned up people and dead kids are always my least favorite. To this day, I still wonder if I was somehow tripping on something I ate by accident, or something else. This was around when I was 10 years old, and I was playing in a room by myself. It was about 11 p.m, and I had a sliding glass door in my room, and the blinds were pulled back. Out of nowhere, the automatic spotlight behind my house turned on. I looked at this sliding glass door and saw a figure started approaching it. At first I thought it was my neighbour, who was older than me and about the same height. But as it got closer, I realised something else. I remember it approached the door slowly. It stopped at the sliding glass door for a few seconds and just started staring at me. It felt like an eternity passed by. I remember specifically how long it felt, when in reality it was probably no more than a few seconds. It was really dark black. It had a rounded head, just like you see aliens in the movies, and was about 6 feet tall, with 2 arms and 2 legs. Really skinny. The thing about it is that it was so close to me on the right, on the other side of the glass, that there's no way I could have mistaken it for a human. I know what I saw, and after a few seconds of staring at me, it just turned to the side and moved away. Long strides. It went out of my view, and I immediately ran out of my room, screaming for my mum. She didn't believe me. I had to sleep in my room that night, knowing I had seen a legit alien a few feet away from me earlier. I'm 23 now, and still get chills to this day when I think about it. My eyes start watering when I think about it. I know it was not a dream. I know what I saw, and no one believes me. The thing that creeps me out the most was its demeanor. I remember it coming slowly up to me and walking slowly away. That's what scares me the most. There was no way to rush into it. It was just watching me. I believe in aliens, but I don't really believe in aliens visiting Earth, so it's been hard to cope with. I think what I saw, if in reality it was an alien, it was what they call a grey. I think we may have seen the same thing. I was on the scene of a murder and a car accident. The murder was by far the worst. I was in high school and had skipped maths class and was hanging out with some friends outside when we heard an altercation break out across the field. I turned just in time to see a guy get stabbed to death by his former son-in-law. The total number of stab wounds was 17. He bled out quickly, but it was agonizing. Hearing him scream, then kind of just accept the fact, most likely from shock, then to unconscious. I couldn't perform CPR when he passed out due to the cut artery. I just had to stand over him and watch him die. That one stuck with me for a long time, and I used to have recurring nightmares because of it. The second incident, the car accident. The guy tried to cross a busy intersection on a red, and a car went through the light. I had just stopped in to tab out a pack of smokes and shoot the shit for a second. Wasn't the first responder that time though. The amount of blood that can come out of your head is, well, a lot. Didn't bother me much when it happened, but the sight of blood kicked back some old memories of the stabbing. This happened a long time ago, but is probably the scariest experience of my childhood. It was a summer day. Me and my friends were playing in the woods. We were both around age 10. And after walking a bit deeper into the woods, I noticed a man sitting on a stump. I instantly got a weird feeling from him. He was an older man and he had a long beard and was holding something in his hands, but I don't remember what it was. We weren't that close to him, but just looking at him, and I got a bit creeped out, and I whispered to my friend, "Don't say anything." But of course the first thing he does is yell at the man, "Hey!" The man turned his head quickly towards us. He stared at us for what seemed like an eternity, until he suddenly dropped whatever he was holding in his hands and began running towards us. Obviously we ran as well. We ran as quickly as we could, shouting for help along the way. When we finally got out of the forest and had some distance, I looked behind me, and the man was nowhere to be seen. We were around the ages of 10, and this was an old man chasing us through the woods. What he would have done, I have no idea. But to a kid, this is terrifying. I was a lifeguard. and was at a swim and meet 6 years ago. Kids are allowed in the shallow end, but people are racing, so most are watching the main pool area. A kid of 3 to 4 in the pool starts crying because they're cold and wants to get out. No parents are coming to the kid's aid, and my colleagues notice and takes a running dive into the 2-foot pool. That didn't turn out well. Me and a bunch of other lifeguards jump in, feet first, and turn her over and lift her enough so her face is above the water. She's semi-conscious, babbling about the kid and her dive, and she's swimming over to him now. Nothing is moving, so we have about 6 people there holding her as steady and as still as possible. 2 more bring the backboard, which we move under her, bringing her up to meet her, and then strap her in before taking her out of the pool and drying her off. EMTs arrive soon after and take her to the hospital. I really don't remember the rest of the evening. Last I recall, she had months of PT in order to have a possibility of having movement again. Parents, watch your damn kids. My parents love antiques. I never really cared for them much, because they never allowed me to touch anything when they brought me shopping with them. So I was always bored. Anyway, a few years ago my mum brought an old Irish teacher's desk in an antique store. It was big. You had to stand behind it to use it, or have a very tall stool, and it was made entirely of wood. I hated it. It creeped me out for some reason, and I still can't explain it. It just gave me a bad vibe. Of course, nobody listened, and she bought it anyway, and used it as her new home office desk. The desk is now in the basement, but used to be in what now is the dining room, where we have enormous mirrors hanging on the wall. The dining room has no wall separation from the piano room, which also has no wall to separate it from the front door. Next to the front door, with no barriers to block it from the large mirror, is yet another mirror, but round and normal sized. Both of the mirrors are antiques and for decoration. One day I was home by myself. It was morning, sun up, but the sky was grey so it wasn't bright. I walked into the piano room to practice, and looked up to my right and saw a person standing in front of the desk. She was wearing a long, pale-coloured pleated dress with dark boots. When I lifted my head, she disappeared. But in the mirror, the larger one, I could see someone behind me in the reflection of us, in the smaller mirror just standing there. Of course, nobody was there when I turned around, but it scared the shit out of me. And to this day, while practicing piano, I see figures darting out of my sight in the mirror, and often hear loud noises accompanying them. It happened again today, in fact. I was practicing piano when a figure formed to my left. I looked up, and something in the mirror had moved. Same with the other mirror when I looked. And when I stopped, there was a loud bang. I really don't believe in ghosts, but I don't not believe in them either. One day, my dad was pulling a priority medical response. Basically, you get a department vehicle with medical supplies and go straight to the scene from your house. Shift from our volunteer department. These junkie parents were smoking crack on their front lawn with their toddler by them, and decided they should get in the car and leave. At the same time, the kid rode behind the car on her bike and got run over. My dad hasn't really talked about it that much to me, but from what he's told me is that she died in his arms. He's never looked at me in the same way since that day. I was staying at a friend's house in Hollywood in the guest room, and was trying to sleep. I think I passed out for an hour or so, but I ended up waking up and being unable to fall back asleep. I do not believe this was sleep paralysis or a dream, because I was fully conscious and awake when it happened. I was also able to move and speak, and see the room decently, even though it was dark. I've had sleep paralysis a few times before. It's very rare for me, and I didn't feel paralyzed or panicked. I was listening to music with my earbuds in, and my eyes closed, when I felt the presence of something in my room, and a tap on my arm. It startled me a bit, and I sat up straighter when I saw in the dark, right beside my bed, the figure of a woman. I couldn't make out much of her features, but she was probably 5'2" and hunched over with very pale skin that seemed to glow. She had messy mid-length black hair, several necklaces, and long earrings. She moved in a very fluid manner and almost seemed to glide as she walked and reached out towards me. She seemed to be trying to hide her face by holding her hand over it and pulling her hairs across it. She held out a handwritten note that had many of the lines on it scratched out aggressively. It seemed like it was about my life. I don't know exactly what happened, but I swear she was able to telepathically communicate with me, and she said, "It's better this way, don't you think?" as she handed me the note to look at. I was almost in a trance or something, because I was in absolute awe of what was happening. But I handed the note back without absorbing any of it and said, "Yeah, I agree," out loud. She took it back and quickly turned away, and just like that was gone, and my door was left open. It took me a good minute to try and process what happened, and I quickly ran over to my friend and his girlfriend's room and asked them if she had come into my room, but she said otherwise. She told me she was having trouble sleeping too, and had seen some odd flashes of light outside her window a few times that night. I went outside to smoke a cigarette, and felt an incredible sense of peace and calmness overcome me, and I didn't feel worried about the encounter, because throughout it all, I didn't feel like I was in danger. She seemed like she was trying to protect me, or watch over me, and I was okay with that. I worked in the coroner's office for a while. I went to a car accident, family of 5 crash. Nobody was wearing their seatbelt. Newborn baby was dead. 7-year-old was dead. 9-year-old was dead. Mum was dead, and Dad survived, but he was drunk. He went 60 miles an hour downhill in a 35 and went headfirst into a tree. The floor of the car was a couple of inches deep in blood. The second one was a couple of teen brothers who were dealing meth for the Chinese and were caught stealing. Both hung from the same tree, rolling on a pristine forest on a beautiful day. To see a couple of decomposing bodies swinging was surreal. My friends and I, of age 11 to 12, were on a housing development in Illinois, and this all happened during summer. My first summer in my new home, out in the sort of sticks. My friend from school and I loved to run around the neighborhood and into the forest behind the homes. While we're out, we noticed an ice cream truck kind of tracking us. It had its music running, so we sort of wrote it off and continued on our adventure. Every time we'd pop out of the woods again, the ice cream truck would never be too far behind. Same driver, same plate. We laughed and joked about it being some weird new business tactic to get kids to buy. However, we were broke, so we just kept playing. The stalking was incessant after a while. Every turn we'd make, no matter where we'd pop up, it would always be near. The driver always pretending not to see us, but keeping pace as we walked. Eventually it was time to go home, and so we did. When I returned home, I told my mother about the experience, and she called the police. After a bit of questioning, they decided I was just letting my imagination run wild, but they checked it out anyway. The initial search of the neighborhood churned up nothing but a single ice cream truck driven by a woman, ran by a reputable company. About a week later, they got a similar report by another girl in the neighborhood. They found the truck with the exact same guy, completely unlicensed, with a little boy unconscious and tied up in the back. A week after gaining my CPR certification, I had to try and perform CPR on a woman dying of a heroin overdose. I was at a thrift store with some friends looking for Halloween costumes, and someone came in saying that someone was passed out in the parking lot. I was in the dressing room, and it just got super quiet. So I came out and told them I was certified, and go take a look, and that they needed to call 911. I go outside and didn't see anyone on the ground. Someone comes out and shouts that the person is in the car that's parked far out by itself. I ran over and honestly freaked out. She was pretty much already dead, completely blue in the face, slumped against her car window. She had the red druggy rings around her eyes, but those were blue too because she was so oxygen deprived. We opened the door, and I'll never forget when we turned her head to see if she still had a pulse. She had tears running down her face. We pulled her out of the car and put her on the ground and took her pulse again, because the first person to do it wasn't sure. We started CPR, and the ambulance arrived about a minute after. They got her strapped up and continued CPR. They had another ambulance come in, and those EMTs got out, and there were about 6 of us surrounding her. The cops told us they had administered some type of drug that can apparently reverse heroin overdoses if given in time, but she was pretty much dead already. They would do the necessary stuff until they could get her to the hospital and call it, according to him. I also remember when we opened the door, there was a heroin needle and empty pill bottles all over the floor. She wasn't very old. We also think she had kids. She had some toys and a car seat, plus 2 named tattoos on her. I was once doing a charity event in high school, where we went to a local mansion. Think of a tiny version of Biltmore, and had scripted scenes in a designated room. We would dress up in clothes that the former house tenants would have worn, and pretended to be the people that used to live in the house. Earlier that week, I had been helping set up the house with decorations, and asked one of the people that tends to the house if there were any ghosts. Her response was, "We do have ghosts, but they're nice. If we change something in the room and they don't like it, they'll change it back overnight. There are times where we change the comforters on the beds, and we come back a few days later, and there's an indentation where it looks as if someone has been sitting on the edge of the bed, but no one has had access to get into the house." So on the night I was helping out, I proceeded to ask if there were any ghosts in the room that I was in with my brother and another person helping out. I looked around and nothing happened. Then I see my brother's face go white, and the person that was with us pointed behind me, and the door to an old armory had swung pretty violently open. The handle to the door to the armory had been taken off, and there was a piece of paper shoved between the 2 doors to keep the armory closed. I thought for sure the logical explanation was that the piece of paper had fallen to the floor and swung open because of it. However, when we tried to make the door swing open after putting the paper back, we couldn't get it to budge at all, much less fly open as it had. One that sticks out to me, and I remember frequently, was a few years back, when we were dispatched to a Pizza Hut for a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When we arrived, I immediately assumed we were seeing a dead on arrival, as the entire maxillary and navel cavity were blown out. As I get near the patient, a 21-year-old male, I see the slightest rise and fall in his chest, and there was a really thready pulse. So we ended up having to crick him out because of his totally obstructed airways. The crazy part was later learning that there was a security video of this kid, who was a cashier at the Pizza Hut, exchanging money with a customer for pizza, then reaching under the counter into a bag, pulling out a handgun and placing it under his chin and pulling the trigger. The frame rate of the video was slow, but you could still see the shock of the customer, as he just stood there frozen for over a minute. He died in surgery at the Level 1 trauma downtown, that I also happened to tech at. This encounter happened to a family friend. He said this occurred somewhere in Italy when he was 15. Walking home from a friend's house through a wooded area, a craft appeared hovering above the trees and approached him. He didn't give a description of the craft or say if it landed or not, but told me there were people inside. I'm not sure if he could see into the craft, or if they left the vehicle, but he said they were around 4 to 5 feet tall. I asked if he was scared, but he said no. He was very excited and overwhelmed with happiness. He said he waved and they waved back, then spoke to him. Again, I'm not sure if he meant verbally or telepathically. And he said they invited him to go with them, far away. But he politely declined, stating he was happy here and didn't want to leave. They departed in the craft and he hurried home, excitedly telling his mother of his encounter. She wasn't pleased to hear his story, and told him never to tell anyone else. They would think badly of him, and also possibly of her. I'm not sure if she even believed him or not. He told me this story with tears in his eyes, saying he was grateful for the experience, and still remembered the overwhelming joy he felt at the time. I'd known him since I was a young child, and trusted him completely. He was always very serious and never joked or lied, as far as I knew. His story surprised me, as I'd never expected him to be the type of person to experience something like this. His emotion in telling me convinced me even more than just trusting his honesty. I'd never seen him so emotional on any other occasion, which made this so much more significant to me. I was a student at the time, third manning with my team leader and a medic. We got called to an overdose, and went flying over there on the blues. We arrive at the house and find a man and a woman in frosty silence. On questioning it, it turns out the dude called the ambulance because she said she would overdose during an argument. Things get a little heated, and we ask the guy to leave for a few minutes while we chat to the lady. There's a whole uncomfortable backstory to this lady, which was irrelevant for this story, but suffice to say, she was a nice woman with some problems, who was just trying to do right by her kids. We double-checked with her when we had some privacy that there hadn't been any violence, and she said that there hadn't been that day or before. The creepy part was when the dude came back in. I was kind of redundant here. My team leader was talking to them about the situation, the medic was making notes, all about the meds the lady has, and I wasn't doing anything productive. They didn't need the three of us there, so I was just watching that creepy guy. There were some small things that just put me on edge. He was saying he'd keep hold of her meds so she wouldn't OD. It didn't seem like it was simply caring. He made a big deal of, well, we've had all this fuss now, and these fine people could be out saving lives, when he was the one who called the ambulance. His entire demeanour seemed to be trying to convey affection and caring, and at one point he tried to put his arm around her and she didn't react. He moved in closer, and she still didn't react. He moved closer still. She was outright ignoring him now. He kind of squeezed her, only a little. In another situation it might have been fine, but it just seemed so out of place. He just did a little grrr noise when he did it. Straight afterwards he looked me right in the eyes, and then moved away to light a cigarette. I consider myself well adjusted. So far I've been able to deal with the creepy hallucinations of the mentally ill, the gore, the dealing with death, but something about that moment of eye contact shook me to my core. There was never enough to act on, not enough to report to social services or the police or anything like that. But I still think about her every now and again, and I hope she's doing okay. There's a dog that my boyfriend sees randomly, and it travels from house to house with us. The first time it happened, we were staying at his dad's house for a bit after we moved to his hometown. We were just getting ready for bed, and I see him stop suddenly before getting in. He starts walking around to my side of the bed, saying something like, "Bella, what are you doing here?" That's one of his dad's dogs. He gets to my side, and I'm looking around confused, since the door was shut and both dogs had been in the living room when I headed in. He swears he saw her. About 30 minutes later, we're both in bed just chatting about the day, and suddenly there's a distinct clicking of toenails on the wood floor going across the room. My boyfriend jumps up, turns the light on, then opens the door to the hallway and searches both side rooms next to ours. He comes back and says that 2 dogs are in the master bedroom passed out. We're both a little creeped out. He saw it 2 more times while we were there, but we just chalked it up to us seeing his dad's golden lab / boxer mix Bella sneaking around the house. The odd thing was, after we moved, it showed up several more times. We'll hear the clicking of toenails, huffing, and he'll see its shadow or a dog walk by the bedroom, from the kitchen or the living room. We have dogs of our own, but there have been times when they're sitting there with us by the couch, and we'll hear those noises, and they'll be in their kennels for bed, and he'll still see it walk by. The dogs don't seem to be too bothered by it, but they'll track something with their eyes, or they'll run to the other room to investigate something that we didn't hear. It doesn't seem mean, and I've gotten used to it, but still kind of creepy when you're home alone and hearing things. Due to mental stress, after taking a call from a really bad wreck. Apparently, after the call from witnesses, he was the first one on scene, which was an upside down and badly crumpled vehicle from a highway collision. He wouldn't give much details about the driver's condition, but assured me upon seeing them he knew that they were gone. He looked through the bent metal of the car, and in the back seat, saw a baby still strapped into the car seat hanging upside down. He rushed to the side of the car and tried to reach through the broken frame of the door in order to undo the harness and collect the still breathing child. He said it started crying as this fumbling woke him up. The way the car was bent though, he couldn't reach his arm far enough to actually undo the harness. So he radioed someone for the jaws of life to come and pry the doors apart. By this point, the baby's head was turning purple from all the blood rushing to it, and she had stopped crying and was just gazing around. So he strained as far as he could, and just tried to lift the baby's head up, with a little pain in his palm. All he could reach. He said he was yelling on the radio, telling them to get here ASAP, and praying for the kid. There's no way he can get this harness himself. While he's holding the head up as best he can, he was paying attention to the breathing of the child, making sure that she still was. The poor girl ended up dying in his hand just a minute or so before the patrolman arrived and were able to get the metal apart. Really messed with his mind, that one. I live on the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. About midway up the coast, I was driving my girlfriend back to her granddad's house, 2 towns over from mine. It's about a 2.5 hour drive on the highways. I had driven her home and spent the day visiting her family. This town she is from is right on the coast. It's a port city. The point is that I'd spent the day there and was now getting ready to drive home. On about 25 to 30 minutes into the drive, I'm on the highway that runs parallel to the mouth of the river on one side, and the CN tracks on the other. So it goes rail on my left, the road I'm on, and then a sort of mini channel where the river ends. I'm driving, it's getting dark, but I'm not tired or drowsy at all. There are a few rest stops along the road on my right, on the riverbank, and I need to slow down because I have to urinate. Then something scurries across the road. And that's almost all that happened. It was four-legged, at least from what I saw. Black. Blacker than black. Unnaturally dark. No texture or anything. It was void of light or colour, just in the shape that it was. It ran out of the bush over the rails, and I was going slow enough that the wind and the highway noise was gone, and I heard it. It sounded like metal tapping as it ran over the ballast and rail. Then the sound if you took a rod or rebar and stabbed it into the ground. Then metal again as it ran in front of me, across the road. Its body was shaped like how some people described a UFO, almost flat-like, like an overall stretched out thing with legs protruding from the front and back. It had no features, no eyes, no face, nor mouth that I could tell, and it ran across the road, limbs stretching as it did so. Then it ran into the rest area and over into the bank, and I'm guessing into the river. I kept driving, and didn't go until I went home 2 hours later. I've tried searching for this thing online but had no luck. If anyone could help me out in trying to figure out what it is, I'd seriously appreciate it. I've drawn a picture, and you'll find it in the description. I was a reserve firefighter / EMT for a large FD. We got a call that came in as vehicle VPED. Typically in my area, those types of calls end up being nothing serious, more often than not. This one turned out to be serious. 9-year-old boy in traumatic full arrest. He was hit by a car while riding his bike home from school. Due to a miscommunication mishap, we were sent to the trauma hospital that was over 13 miles away, even though the nearest receiving ER that had the ability to stabilize was only 2 to 3 miles away. It took us over 20 minutes to get there, even with a police escort due to traffic. It was rough, not only because of that, but because I had to do CPR on a child that I knew was not going to make it for over 20 minutes. Halfway to the hospital, he had brain matter coming out of his nose and CSF out of his ears. He was declared dead shortly after we transferred him to the hospital gurney. I had to sit outside in the ambulance bay and catch my breath. While sitting out there, I saw the parents of the boy getting dropped off by the police department and rush inside, only to find out their child was dead. I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt, that maybe there was some way, somehow, something more I could have done to save their child's life. This call messed me up for a while. Anyway, I saw a child on a bike thereafter, and it gave me flashbacks of this 9-year-old boy lying lifeless on a street. Stationed in Erlangen, Germany, between 1990 to 1993. But I lived off post in Nuremberg. I lived in a condominium off Düsseldorf with my then wife and 2 daughters. My oldest daughter was 3 at the time and would often come running into our bedroom crying and complaining of a monkey in her room. She didn't have any toys of monkeys or apes, so it was kind of baffling to understand her on her fear. Their bedroom and ours were across from each other between the hallway, and we could see directly into their bedroom from ours. One late night, sitting up in bed reading, I caught movement out of my right side. Thinking one of my kids may be up, I walked to their room, but they were both asleep. I go back to my bed and book, and again I notice movement, so I glanced over to their room from my bed, and that's when I saw what appeared to be the outline of a child as it walked into the bedroom where my daughters were asleep. I launched out of my bed and covered the distance between my room and theirs in maybe 4 leaps. Nothing. My daughters were both sleeping. This was mid-tour for me, so for the remaining year and a half, we all slept in our room. This story is not my own. It was told to me by my grandfather, who had passed away last year and just wanted to get his stories out there on the internet. As a kid, I always knew my grandfather was an EMT for his local town before moving to live with my parents and I. So he always told me the typical put your seatbelt on and other important yet common knowledge sort of stuff. As I got older, I liked spending time with him and often watched shows with him. While watching an episode of Chicago Fire, I asked him what the worst call he ever had was. He told me that he had been an EMT and a firefighter for a while, and this particular night he was riding in the ambulance. They got a call over the radio for shots fired, and the victim was a teen. As they told him, the parents called in the shots. They were only a few minutes away, and they knew by the nature of the call that it was most likely a suicide. When they arrived on scene, they were supposed to wait for the police to show up due to the shots fired, but the mother of the kid ran outside and said that her son shot himself. They know they shouldn't have, but they rushed upstairs and into the house, into the boy's bedroom, and found the kid on the floor, laying next to a shotgun. You could see the skull and brain matter scattered on the ceiling and walls, and the kid's face down on the ground. When he reached down to get a pulse, just to make sure, the kid rolled over and sat up. It scared the crap out of him, and he jumped back and gasped. The kid was sitting up, mumbling incoherent words. The training kicked in, as he started wrapping his head, even though you could see through the skull, and the kid had blood streaming down his head. After he was wrapped up, another ambulance came and rushed him to the nearest hospital. He puked after the kid was taken away, and it was the only time he ever puked on the job. My sister used to volunteer for the British Red Cross. On occasion, she did motorcycle or motocross events, and one day, this guy came off his motorcycle and refused to collar. He seemed like a nice guy, and my sister was annoyed that she had to respect his wishes, despite how dangerous the choice was. But they at least requested that he keep his helmet on to keep his neck in place. He was able to sit up on his own, but they at least convinced him to get on a stretcher, and he agreed to their terms. It was just outside the hospital that the guy decided he was too warm in his helmet and sat up. My sister tried to keep his helmet on and get him to lie down, but he was stronger than her and insisted he do it. Despite her best efforts, he pulled his helmet off, and the moment he did, he slammed down on the stretcher again. His neck had been broken on impact, and the moment he had removed the helmet, which was keeping everything in place, his broken spine had shifted and severed the spinal cord. It was, as my sister described it, something like an internal decapitation. They could do nothing for him. It wasn't about the blood and gore, there was none of that. It was knowing that they'd been so close to saving his life. They were outside the hospital. All they had to do was to get him to keep his helmet on, and she failed. Despite the fact it wasn't her fault, I saw what it did to her, and it wasn't funny. Sometimes it's not the bloody things that mess up a person, but the quiet failures.